Right, this is organic.
Okay.
There's no dress rehearsal here. But basically, our goal today is to talk about chapter 13. Chapter 13 is kind of like if we were talking about houses, then we're talking about building materials in chapter 13. We're talking about concrete and drywall and carpet and paint and shingles and whatever and stuff like that, and wood. And that's sort of what chapter 13 is about. When it says nervous tissue, that's what it means. And so just going down this list of things we have here, the first point says discuss the organization and the general function of the nervous system. If you were going to say, in a sentence or whatever, what the nervous system does, how would you say it?
It transmits something. I don't know the word.
It transmits things.
Yes.
And what else? It also receives things. So it's the nervous system gives commands and it receives information. Just like him who just met my boss, a manager, he gets information from employees. He gets all information from all over the place, and he decides what to do with it and how to run his business and stuff like that. I do not tend to ask you guys, which of the following is a function of the nervous system? I sort of assume that most people already get that. Maybe I should throw it on there for an easy question. Maybe I'll do that this time. But I do not tend to put send motor commands, receive sensory information, digest food, and saying which one of these is not a nervous system function. So for this point, probably the meat of this point is the organization. And, the anatomic organization, so one thing that a person could do if they were trying to figure out how to do this would be to go to this chapter outline at the end and see what are they saying about it. The organization here, what they're talking about is ways of categorizing. So you could categorize it into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. You can categorize it into a somatic and a visceral. Do you remember the difference between somatic and visceral?
No.
That has to do with basically the word aware. If you're aware of something, that's under the umbrella of somatic. Things that you're unaware of, you could also say subconscious or behind the scenes or below the surface. There's so much stuff in our bodies that that is going on behind the scenes. That's the visceral side of things. Visceral means organs. So an example is our brain knows exactly if our intestines are stretched or if they're decompressed and small. It knows exactly where all our joints are and how they're bent. It knows exactly what the blood pressure is in different parts of the bloodstream and all that kind of stuff that we don't really think about or even know. You couldn't tell me if your radial artery is dilated and big or squeezed out and constricted. We have no idea. That's visceral stuff. Somatic means I'm aware of it. Another word could be voluntary. And so there's somatic motor. That's a voluntary movement. That's moving your skeletal muscles. That's make a fist, grab a pencil, whatever. There's also somatic sensory stuff, and that's stuff that you can feel. I stabbed myself, I felt it. Or temperature, or even vibration of a phone, stuff like that. So that kind of functional category is another way that it's organized. And what else? I mean, that's about it for that one. There's and I guess the other thing to point out would be the words afferent and efferent. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the difference between those?
Yes, one sends things or carries to, and then to and from was the question.
Yes, exactly. To and fro. To and from, and the to and from is in relationship to the central nervous system. So you could say things that are going to the central nervous system or towards or approaching it is afferent. Afferent is approach. It's things coming in to the central nervous system. It's all this sensory information. Efferent is exit. E is for exit. Yeah, it's things that are leaving.
Arrive.
So that's all the motor stuff. And it's motor somatic and it's motor visceral. It's motor somatic, that is move my muscle. But it's also somatic motor. Things like speed up, the brain says, speed up the heart rate. The brain says, constrict the blood vessels, propel the food through the intestine. All the things that we're not aware of and doing voluntarily. It's still motor. It's still commands going out. That's all the efferent stuff.
So you just mean organization, like all of those things, I guess you just explained, like no, like just the somatic and visceral,
Mm-hmm.
and then afferent and efferent, and like you don't mean specific functions.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly. These things are all. I gave some specific examples, I guess, but these things are all kind of general category kind of things. How to break the nervous system up into, different bullet points and different categories and stuff like that. All general stuff, and it's a pretty short. Section. The visceral side of things, you've noticed that we've pretty much skipped, you guys. It's something we're going to go over in the next system. It's under the umbrella of what we call the autonomic nervous system, and it's something that we're not really dealing with a lot right now. The next section is 13.2. It asks about the two cell types. Do you remember the two cell types?
Do not.
So I'll give you one, and one is the neurons themselves. They're the ones that get all the press. They're the ones that everyone has heard of. That everybody recognizes the characteristic shapes of neurons. The other one are the supporting cells. Those are the glial cells. And there are 4 kinds of glial cells in the central nervous system. They're the astrocytes, the ependymal cells, the oligodendrocytes, and the microglia. And they all have a different function, and they're all within the central nervous system. A couple of those have a kind of a cousin that does the same thing out in the peripheral nervous system, but it has often a different name. An example is the central nervous system has oligodendrocytes. Those are the ones that wrap the axons in that myelin insulation. There are cells that do the same thing in the PNS, but they're called Schwann cells. So it's like they do the same thing, but they get a different name. It's pain. It's pain for anatomy students is the only reason.
It's like how you go from subclavian to axillary, it just switches wherever it is.
Yes.
Okay.
It's the same tube. It's the same blood vessel, but it has a different name because So it's important to know the 4 glial cells, and it's important to know in a sentence what they do. If I was going to say oligodendrocytes, what they do in a sentence, I'd say they myelinate axons, or I could say they wrap axons of neurons in myelin. The kind of next question there is, what's myelin? But maybe we'll get to that in a second, but that's what oligodendrocytes do. The next thing might be these astrocytes, and what do they do? Do you remember what the astrocytes do?
See, they're attached.
They're attached specifically to the capillaries and blood vessels. They set up what we call the blood-brain barrier. There's a barrier here of their projections of their cells, cell projections and of their cell membrane that wraps around the blood vessels, and it's another layer of filter that decides what gets to come into the brain from the bloodstream. Out here, anything that can diffuse in and out of a capillary and anything that can fit gets to come and go. But in the brain, there's an additional level of security that kind of filters certain things out. So that's would be astrocytes. What astrocytes do, they establish the blood-brain barrier. 2 would be oligodendrocytes. 3 would be, you could say, microglia. They're these cells that have these feather duster kind of projections. They're the street sweepers. They're the phagocytes that come and eat debris and different things like that, and they clean up anything that's not supposed to be there. And they do it specifically by engulfing the thing and eating it, pulling it into its cytoplasm. There's cells like this all over the body. They do the same thing, but they get a different name. In the lung, they're called alveolar macrophages, or dust cells. In the liver, they're called Kupffer cells. There's a name for it. It's painful. But that's what those are. And the last one would be these ependymal cells. These are the cells that produce cerebrospinal fluid. So 4 ependymal cells produce CSF. That's it, and that's checked off. 13.3. There's plenty more to say about each of those. Plenty more to say. You could go there and say, well, what types of things do astrocytes let through, and what kind of things do they filter? We're not going into that much detail. We're just not. So that's what we need for that one. We need their names. You know that they belong in the category of neuroglia, the 4, and then a sentence about what they do. Section 13.4 is the structure of a typical neuron. And remember, I don't have it here, but we actually crossed off the basis of classifications. We crossed that off. So the first part of this question is discuss the structure of a typical neuron. And on page 342, figure 13.4, there's 4 boxes. So there's 4 things here. There's more parts of a neuron than 4, but for our purposes, it's 4 things. There's a cell body, which is like headquarters. It's where the nucleus is. It's where almost all the organelles are. And then it's got these things coming into it, dendrites. Do you remember what purpose they serve or what they're for?
I could guess, but I don't know.
So guess.
They look like they're going to attach to something, but I don't know.
Correct. And what you could say is, maybe you could say something is attached to them. This is where input into the neuron comes in. This is where they receive messages. Sometimes I write the word ears next to dendrites, and I say they're the ears of the neuron, because they are stimulated by other things. And it's kind of like if the neuron is Dr. Justice, they're like an email from me, and a phone call from someone with a complaint, and a budget report coming onto his desk, and all those things coming in. It's all processed in the second one, the second box, which is a cell body. Cell body is where all the processing and decision making happens. And then if he's going to respond or reply, that's a message he's sending out. That message is going to travel to the output. This 4th box, or the axon terminals, that's where the message is sent. This could be an axon terminal of a different neuron, making a synapse with a dendrite. This could be the dendrites of this, there could be dendrites here, hearing messages from other cells. Also, occasionally, this says environmental changes. Occasionally, these things respond to chemicals, medications, changes in electrolytes, whatever, many things. But anything that a neuron is going to hear, any input, any information it gets, that one comes through here at the dendrites, processed, and decisions are made, and it says, all right, well, I'm going to send whatever message. And the message is sent here. The point of the axon, the 3rd box, is that this is the highway it takes. It's the highway it takes to get there. And that is really the nutshell for our purposes. Cell body is, so dendrites, I wrote ears. Cell body, I could write HQ or headquarters. Axon terminals, I could write mouth. And then axon, what could we write for axon? I don't know.
I have it in my notes, but I don't remember what you said.
I don't remember what I said either. You could say highway maybe, or
I think that's fair.
Or something like that. I don't know. There's a few analogies you can make, but the point is, a message is born in the cell body. That message is spoken at the axon terminal, but it gets from that point A to point B by way of the axon. So that's 13.4. 13.7 talks about the microanatomy of the synapse and summarizing the events that occur. If you were going to say what a synapse is, in general, what's a synapse?
Like the synapse of a book? I don't know.
A synapse, if I was going to break it down into one word, I would use the word communication. It's a point of communication between a neuron saying something and then somebody else is hearing it. So what I drew is a little stick figure. I'll show it to the camera, but this is neuron A. It's saying something. This is neuron B, who's hearing it with his big ear. The conversation And so you could call this whole setup, this whole point of communication, you could call it a synapse. Synapse is where a nerve communicates to a target organ. Sometimes the other thing is another nerve, sometimes it's a gland, sometimes it's a skeletal muscle, but it's this point where that blue axon terminal meets a purple something else. And the important thing to note about this is a one-way conversation. And the picture of a synapse in the book is on page 352, figure 13.4. This conversation starts here before the synapse and it ends up here. So this is sometimes called the presynaptic cell. And this one is sometimes called the postsynaptic cell. The space in between is a cleft, the synaptic cleft. But this message goes there, one direction. This cell does not talk back to that terminal. This cell might have a axon terminal down here that somehow circles around, but it does not go back and forth. It goes in one direction. It's A saying something to B. And there is